I think this movie might need some more hyenas. I wonder if they ever considered throwing in a few more scenes with them. Hey everybody, welcome to Mainely Movies. As part of my Exorcist review series, today I'm going to be talking about the fifth film in the Exorcist franchise, 2005 supernatural horror prequel, Dominion, prequel to The Exorcist. If you're new here, please consider subscribing for a variety of movie-related content, like reviews, rank lists, and trailer reactions. All my reviews include a breakdown of the pros and cons, my rating, and some tailored film recommendations, so be sure to watch through to the end of this video for all of that extra content. Dominion, prequel to The Exorcist, stars Stellan Skarsgård, Gabriel Mann, and Billy Crawford, and was directed by Paul Schrader. Set in 1947, it tells the story of former Father Merrin, who must regain his faith after encountering a demon during an archaeological excavation in Kenya. I know what you're thinking. Didn't I already just watch her review of The Exorcist prequel? Yes, and also no. But I promise this weird sense of deja vu you have is very warranted, because there are actually two prequels to The Exorcist, and they're essentially the same movie. This whole Exorcist prequel thing is a very unique scenario in cinema. Not because a prequel to one of the most iconic horror films of all time was released 30 years after the fact, but rather because it serves as a case study, not only of one of the most blatant incidences of studio interference, but also of the significant effect that direction can have on a film. Paul Schrader was tasked with directing an Exorcist prequel, which he completed in 2003. But the studio was not happy with his final product, and even after Schrader recut the film several times, they still shelved it. But rather than giving up on the Exorcist prequel plan, they hired a new director, Renny Harlan, to oversee a script rework and reshoot the film in its entirety, retaining Stellan Skarsgård in the lead role. That reworked film was released as Exorcist the Beginning in 2004, and was a critical and financial failure. So, the following year, the studio released Paul Schrader's version as Dominion, prequel to The Exorcist. As I said in my review of Exorcist the Beginning, I think the idea of a prequel to The Exorcist had potential. It wasn't something that was necessary, but there was enough intrigue to the story of Father Merrin's past dealing with Pazuzu to potentially craft an interesting story. But as was the case with Exorcist the Beginning, that idea is squandered here. Now, that probably doesn't come as much of a surprise, given the intertwined history of these two prequels and the fact that they're basically the same movie. There was some script tweaking ahead of Harlan's version of the film, so there are a handful of plot changes regarding the possession and the role of the British military in the movie. And the presence and story importance of certain characters differ slightly from one prequel to the next, but as a whole, these two films boil down to the same story bones, which is sure to induce a weird sense of deja vu in viewers. Despite telling the same story and featuring Stellan Skarsgård in the exact same role, these two movies do manage to feel different from one another. Sort of. And this is really where the case study aspect of the scenario gets interesting, because it showcases how different directors can take the same material, imbue it with their own tone and style, and end up with different films. From a filmmaking perspective, Dominion is probably the stronger of the two films. It's a bit less random, and the cinematography and editing are slightly better, but it doesn't have much of a distinct identity. Exorcist the Beginning feels like a 2000s horror music video at times, but even with the studio-requested shock and gore, it feels like a more intentional film with a specific vision. It might not be the most enjoyable vision, but at least it doesn't languish in the way that this one does. Both films do suffer from some pretty awful CGI, though. It's not quite as frequently used here in Dominion, but it's terrible and so distractingly noticeable. What is it with the hyena obsession of these films? Much like the second filmed but first released Exorcist the Beginning, Dominion is a disappointing film, and an even worse prequel to The Exorcist. The films in this franchise have taken many different approaches to the story, none ever quite matching the uncomfortable dread of the original. So, a prequel could get away with being slightly different as well, but this film is a far cry from anything in The Exorcist. The majority of the movie, you're left waiting for something to happen, preferably something scary or suspenseful, but after a while, you find yourself willing to take just about anything. But the movie just keeps you waiting and waiting, and when we finally do reach something reminiscent of The Exorcist, it's underwhelming and anticlimactic. The tone of Exorcist the Beginning might not have been a perfect match either, but at least it tried to make connections to the first film, with the Pazuzu statue and the St. Joseph medallion. This film honestly might have fared better if it had done away with all of its Exorcist connections and tried to be a standalone horror drama. I'm all for a director's creative freedom, so I'm glad that this film got a release, but at the same time, I certainly get why this film was shelved. Alright, let's talk about the pros and cons. The only real pro here for me is the concept. I don't think it was executed well, but the idea of an Exorcist prequel, focusing on a slightly younger Father Merrin, had potential. Honing in on his bizarre, previously unexplained archaeological background, telling the story of his hinted-at past encounter with Pazuzu. The story even brings in a crisis of faith component to draw a thematic parallel with Father Karras in the first film. A prequel wasn't necessary, but the concept had definite potential. Unfortunately, it was botched. Twice. On the con side, this film has a lot of the same problems as its sister film, Exorcist the Beginning. The biggest issue here is the focus. The story doesn't jump around quite as randomly as its prequel partner, but it still doesn't do a great job of building up Father Merrin as a character or of establishing the backstory of his and Pazuzu. Elements of each exist here, but the story is preoccupied with the conflict between the British military and the native villagers. It wouldn't be a bad storyline to focus on in another film, but it's a bizarre, prominent plotline in an Exorcist film. Con number 2 is the CGI. Whew, it is rough in this film. This is another problem the two prequels share, but even though CGI isn't used quite as often in this film, I think the quality of it is much worse. There are some unconvincing moments with bugs, but the worst CGI offenders here are the hyenas. There are actually fewer hyena scenes in this version of the film, and they're not on screen for nearly as long, but it's almost always brightly lit when they do show up, so the poor CGI can't be hidden in darkness. There's an absolutely absurd moment with a hyena and a cow, and the first time we see the hyenas, the quality's like a joke. It looks like a PS2 quality previs scene that they never went back to actually finish, despite having several years to do so. The third con is how dull this film is. These Exorcist movies vary quite a bit, and they're not always the most exciting films, but they usually have somewhat interesting things to latch onto. Characters, subplots, even a jump scare to keep you awake enough to keep going. But this one? There's just nothing. Exorcist the Beginning wasn't the most interesting film either, but at least its shock value and cheap jump scares kept it from ever becoming quite as boring as this film. Before I give you my rating and recommendations, I want to remind you that if you're interested in buying Dominion, prequel to The Exorcist, or any of the other films I mentioned today, I do have affiliate links for all of them in the description below. I get a small commission from anything you buy using one of my links, so I'd really appreciate it if you use them if you're in the market for any of these movies. I'm gonna give Dominion, prequel to The Exorcist, 1.5 out of 5 paws. Although filmed first, this movie suffers from many of the same issues as the first released Exorcist prequel, Exorcist the Beginning. The concept had potential, but this is a dull movie, devoid of suspense or scares, but full of lifeless performances, unrelated subplots, and awful CGI. I would recommend Dominion, prequel to The Exorcist, to people who are curious to see two different directors' takes on the same film. From that perspective, the pairing of Dominion and Exorcist the Beginning is somewhat interesting. They're basically the same story, so back-to-back viewings are especially tedious, but the stylistic differences would make for an interesting film school lecture. Apart from academic reasons, I would only recommend this to franchise completionists, and even then, it feels unnecessarily redundant. If you liked Dominion, prequel to The Exorcist, I would obviously recommend Exorcist the Beginning. Not only is it another Exorcist prequel, starring Stellan Skarsgård as Father Merrin, but these two films are inextricably linked by studio interference and production issues. If you'd like another Paul Schrader film about a priest experiencing a crisis of faith, you might want to watch First Reformed. It's not a horror film, but it's surprisingly less restrained and subdued than Dominion is, really showcasing Schrader's directorial style. If you found the conflict between the British military and villagers interesting, you should check out Breaker Morant. It has nothing to do with Exorcist horror, but it's an engaging war drama focusing on the trial of soldiers accused of committing war crimes during the Boer War. Alright, a couple questions for you guys. Number 1. Have you seen Dominion, prequel to The Exorcist? If so, what'd you think of it? And number 2, what are 2 films that give you deja vu? Be sure to leave your answers in the comments below so we can get a discussion going. Alright, so if you got some enjoyment, insider information on this review, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit that like button. And if you haven't done so already, please hit subscribe if you're at it to see more videos like this. Till next time, this has been Alyssa with Mainly Movies. The way life should be.